9, 8.
You're watching
7,
Experience Comic Culture and Sales.
5,
Streaming live daily to
4,
Facebook, YouTube,
3,
Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
Hey, how's it going? It's Christopher, aka the Bronze Age Nerd. Welcome to Devil's Advocates. I'm one of your hosts, and we'll bring in our other host here in a minute. But first, I wanted to talk to you about the inspiration for tonight's show. If you're not familiar, we actually take suggestions from you, the viewing audience, on what we should talk about every week. And this is the first time that we've had a suggestion that's made it to the show stage, and that suggestion comes from Eddie Von B. I'm going to go ahead and read the suggestion that they sent in, and we can kind of frame the entire conversation tonight around that. Eddie sent in, do political/social views belong in comics, or should comics try their best to stay away from that to avoid turning off chunks of potential readers? Personally, I hate it when social or political views are in comics. I read comics to escape from the anxieties of the real world, so I wish the real world would stay out of comics. Now, if you follow me and my channel, you might know that I actually treat my channel a bit like Thanksgiving Day. I stay away from politics and religion, and it's because I don't want to alienate part of my audience, and I still want to be able to have those intelligent conversations. So tonight, we're going to aim to have an intelligent conversation at a high level around the topic of agendas in comic books. Do they belong? Are they helpful for comic books? And what does that even mean? So to kind of frame the conversation around that a little bit, I want to read the Merriam-Webster definition for what an agenda is. This is the second definition, the first one being a list or outline of things to be considered or done. But the way they define an agenda is an underlying, often ideological plan or program. So let's keep that in mind, and we'll be right back after this to talk about agendas in comic books. Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm back, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kyle. Hey, Kyle.
Hello.
How's it going tonight?
I'm always unprepared when I don't do the cold open.
Throws you off.
Bring me on. Because it's like, you know that thing, like, you remember those old cars where you had to crank start them?
Yeah.
Like on the Waltons? That's how my brain kind of works.
Right. Got to get a running start.
A second to get... Running at the beginning of the
I
show.
can totally relate to that.
It's been a long few days, so it's even, you know.
For sure. And you know, I just really want to take an extra minute to reiterate at the top of the show here. This is a topic, you know, I made a post on Instagram a couple hours before the show went up, kind of advertising the show, and there's a lot of assumptions made when you start talking about stuff like this in a social media format. And look, straight to the point here, I want to really have that adult-themed conversation around this, where it is not adult-themed, but an adult tone conversation, which is, let's stay mature, let's stay respectful. I will listen to your opinions. You can listen to my opinions. If you believe that certain agendas belong in comic books or don't belong in comic books, I am fine having that conversation with you here. But let's do it in a respectful manner.
Yeah, and I do want to say that the Experience, by and large, has a policy where we don't discuss politics on the shows, on the channel at all. But when certain aspects of a conversation like this one are warranted, we'll have those conversations with the understanding that, look, first of all, be cool. Like, we're going to try and have a talk that's as level-headed and as balanced and as nuanced as needs to be. But if people start getting super arguey or start coming for people in the comments or start, you know, that kind of stuff, we're going to have to either stop or we're going to have to put people in timeout. Like, it's going to be kind of tightly restricted in that regard. So as long as everybody is civil in the comments and everybody's civil on the air, and if you call in, you're civil, we're going to be good. Yeah. But when we lose that civility, we lose the ability to have these conversations, and that's a thing that we don't want.
Agreed. So, and that goes for all, you know, all ends of the spectrum here. Like, just be nice to the other people having their comments and saying what they want to say, and we'll all get along just fine. So, you know, I started out, one of the things I wanted to do, Kyle, was read that definition, which once again is an underlying or often ideological plan or program. And I think that's really important to frame this conversation with, because when you talk about do agendas belong in comic books, there's a knee-jerk reaction that happens right away where people think, oh, you're talking about this thing or that thing. And that actually is not necessarily the case when I ask that question. I think that you could also make the argument that it's maybe a bit of a loaded question because every comic book has an agenda, even if that agenda is just to sell comic books or just to tell a cool story or just to share yourself or try to get better at comic books. Those are agendas as well. But obviously, a huge part of this conversation revolves around having a more, again, ideological plan in your comic books. And I think that that's kind of the interesting framework for this conversation. Do you agree with that opinion?
Yeah, I do. I think, I'll be honest, I've got a lot of sort of wrapped up into the original question.
Yeah.
That Ed asked. And so, like, in terms of do I agree with that state? Absolutely. I think that part of what we have to be very careful of as we talk about this is understanding what role agendas and politic and all of this kind of stuff have played in comics since the inception of the medium, right? And I think it's really important to remember those things when we have these conversations, because comics in and of themselves cannot be separated from an agenda. They've never existed without one. So to suggest that they shouldn't have one now is misrepresenting, misunderstanding, and mischaracterizing the medium as a whole. That said, there's plenty of room for conversations about agendas, concepts, beliefs, whatever, that we disagree with.
Yeah. Well, and
I think remembering those things is super important when we talk about the framework of should comics be escapism or should they not be?
Yeah. And to address that, I think, you brought up a good point. Look, part of how the world works now is an idea makes it into the zeitgeist. And for better or worse, the majority of the population finds one of two sides to be on about that topic. And I'm literally being general on purpose here. It could be anything. Did you like the finale of that show that was on? No, it was lame.
The easiest way to remember this is the pineapple on pizza debate.
Yeah, 100%. Which, by the way, if you want to know everything you need to know about me, pineapple is my favorite topping on pizza. So
pineapple does not belong on pizza. You're wrong.
No, pineapple, sweet and spicy. Pineapple and pepperoni is delicious. Add some jalapenos.
What sauce?
With a tomato sauce.
No. If you have a barbecue sauce or some other sauce on a pizza, I will give you pineapple.
Well, I would also eat that. Don't get me wrong.
But not with a red sauce. No.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Nope.
The only one that would throw me off is if you put like a garlic or maybe a garlic, but like an Alfredo type sauce on there. Hell no.
See, we're already trying not to talk about this topic. But I'm gonna tell you a story real quick. We had a barbecue competition this past Saturday where we were competing in the Famous Dave's Barbecue All-Stars. And we had to cook a cook's choice category, and we did bacon donuts, which are a pineapple covered in mozzarella cheese, wrapped in bacon with barbecue rub and barbecue sauce on it.
Okay.
We didn't win, but I was pretty happy with it. But we did qualify for the World Food Championships. We came in. We did win the competition. We just didn't win that category.
There we go. Yeah,
pineapple is a loser.
Pineapple is delicious, and
we came in last with the pineapple dish, by the way, in that category. Pineapple.
Well, it's because you don't have the true understanding and love of pineapple in the first place. If you build on the foundation of pineapple, much like SpongeBob, you will be successful. And that's Kyle and I just demonstrated the exact core of what I'm trying to talk about here perfectly, which is I'm glad you brought up that example. Again, you put any idea into the zeitgeist, and what does that mean? I understand sometimes people don't really understand what that means. The court of public opinion, the ether where everybody's talking about it. You could almost say the internet in some ways, where everybody's having that conversation. No spoilers, don't worry. But like, Ahsoka comes out. Okay, I have opinions about this. Okay, I have opinions about that. They ruined this character. They made this character awesome. You're going to find usually, and there's more than two, but for the mass majority of people, it's going to fall into two camps. And look, you could obviously compare that to politics. I'm not going to, but that is something that happens with just about every topic that gets brought up. So that's part of what gets baked into this conversation. And I think that has a lot to do with how comics today are viewed, because they come out in that same system where everything has to be analyzed and people have to kind of choose thumbs up or thumbs down depending on their take on it, and often in some ways depending on how much they agree with everybody online talking about it. Like, I really like this person's opinion, so all of a sudden that's my opinion. I'm not necessarily saying there's anything wrong with that, but that is how things work today for movies, TV shows, books, and comic books, and a lot of other things. So when it comes to looking at comic books today, I think it's really interesting if you compare them to comic books of yesterday. You will find that there's some key differences in how those comics are regarded. But if those comic books had come out today, it might be a much different story.
Right. And so one of the things that we started with, and I mentioned it already, and we mentioned it when we were talking yesterday when we were prepping, is comic books have never existed sans agenda.
Yeah.
They've had an agenda since day one. Superman and the things he went through were algorithms of Jewish Americans Jewish Americans living in this country at the time when Superman was created. The dreams of little boys who didn't see themselves represented anywhere were put into Superman to represent them. Captain America doesn't exist if he doesn't have Hitler to punch. There are comic books have never the X-Men was a thank you, throw me off there. But the X-Men have never existed outside of an allegory for race relations and civil rights. Like, there's this idea that, I would say with very few exceptions, and those exceptions being the things that transitioned from funny books into comic books.
Yeah.
So your Archies, your Garfields, and even Garfield has an agenda. Let's be real. Garfield's agenda is for the 4-day work week, but and socialized lasagna.
Right.
But every comic book that started off as a comic book has started off with some sort of agenda. And to try and make a comic book that is without an agenda is in fact giving a comic book agenda. Well, that's what I'm saying. Race relations, literally any other social rights group, right?
Yeah.
Any other social rights argument for the X-Men, right? LGBTQIA issues, race relations, immigration, segregate. All of these things are prevalent in the X-Men as an allegory.
Yeah.
And now the X-Men are off on a little island, like doing their own thing. So there's isolationism. Like, when you get into the things that the X-Men are maybe the deepest there. But yeah, it's everything has an agenda. So the question becomes, how do you interact with that agenda, right? And if you don't like an agenda, does that make the comic good or bad, or does that just make it not for you? And that's kind of where we started framing this conversation, right?
Yeah. And actually, so that's while we're discussing this, chat, I want you to chime in on that. Do you think it's possible to read a comic book that you enjoy, but you don't agree with the agenda of?
Absolutely.
And I have my own answer for that, but I also think there's people that don't want to engage with that type of philosophy. Let me know. I love doing something like that.
Yes, absolutely. But I'll give you an example of the opposite of a comic book that I don't enjoy, but I agree with the agenda.
Okay.
And that is Money Shot by Tim Seeley. We've discussed this. I don't really enjoy the cheesecake or the kind of raunchy humor or some of the things that are seen in that book. Yeah. But at the underlying agenda of that book is about funding, of discovery, and putting money towards learning something new. If you don't know, in the current series of Money Shot, these astronauts are essentially having an OnlyFans because the money they bring in funds their research. Well, why aren't we spending money on scientific research? I think that's a necessary thing. I also think we need to spend more time going to space that isn't sponsored by the dude who owns Twitter or the dude who owns the Amazon or whatever. Like, But I agree with his ideology. I agree with his agenda, but I don't love the book.
Yeah.
Conversely, Punisher is a book that in big ways I really love the character, but there were times where, especially when Garth Ennis was writing Punisher, it got a little heavy-handed on some of the America stuff that was happening in the book.
Yeah.
And so I absolutely, you can read a book that you enjoy or a character that you enjoy without necessarily agreeing with the agenda of the book. But I think that as we talk about it, we're going to find that that's the first thing that's a turnoff. It's a lot harder to get past that if you disagree with whatever the message that a book is trying to give you is giving you.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with how and why people approach certain comic books on their pull lists or pulling them out of long boxes to read or whatever it might be. Like, there's a lot of people that and I think that this is totally fair, by the way. It goes to Eddie's comment originally. So I'm going to go back and read one section of that. If I can pull it up here. He mentioned how it's kind of a turnoff because it's escapism for him. He wants and that, look, there's nothing wrong with that. If you engage with comic books because you want to, enjoy a new world or a fantasy, or it's like a fantasy sci-fi world for you, that's fine. Now, I would also argue that there's a lot of great science fiction and fantasy out there, including in comic books, where the ideology is what makes the core of that interesting, even though it's told through this fantastical lens.
Right.
And I think, a lot of content out there like Star Trek or Gene Roddenberry, a lot of great content creators out there. That's the what they've put forward is their message. But yeah, there's a lot of people that will not engage with that material because the title, the cover, the obvious, aspect that they're trying to discuss is going to turn them off to that. That's okay. That's not necessarily a problem. And then there are people that want to seek out comic books that are going to challenge their notions of what a comic book should be, or kind of like avant-garde, if you will. And that's also awesome. There's nothing wrong with that either. I think it really depends on what people want to read. But where I think it gets interesting is kind of coming back to this concept of, kind of comes with something we talked about many times, yucking somebody's yum, right? Like, there's people that are all too willing to go, seagull drop their bombs all over somebody else's ideologies,
Right.
And what they look for in comic books.
So there's a story we're going to take. We need to take a quick reset here. I think we're going to skip the first break, Jay, just so you're aware, and open up the phone lines. 567-318-6507, 567-318-6507 if you want to call in. We'll get that scrolling up here at the bottom in just a second. But there's an interesting story that we didn't talk about yesterday that I think is very interesting. There was a time in the 50s and the early 60s where Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, who had been working on Captain America, became incredibly disenfranchised with the agenda that Marvel wanted to put on Captain America. And left the book and created Fighting American, which I've often, when I show people the book, I go, legally not Captain America, everybody. It's the same character with the same sort of origins, all this kind of stuff. It's basically the same, but it's just different enough. And it let them deal more with, Marvel wanted Captain America to keep punching Nazis and the Red Skull and these, Hydra agents and this kind of stuff, but not deal with the very real, at the time, communism scare and the Red Scare. Murdoch, I love that comment. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute because that was a book where I learned a lot. So I want to come back to that. Thank you. But those guys left and had to go do another book because even they didn't like the agenda that was being placed on the character. And they created the character and were doing the thing. So I think it's important to remember, too, that agendas change and are manipulated and manipulated is oftentimes used in a negative context. I just mean an agenda that is created with a character is changed by someone other than the creator, other than the artist, other than the writer, editorial or legal or somebody else gets involved, and now all of a sudden, for lack of a better term, that idea is bastardized to the point where maybe it's not the same agenda you recognize anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Absolutely. I think should we get to some of these comments that have come through?
Let's hit some of the comments, and then we'll come back around to, I think, the second point we need to talk about that will really start to frame this up even more for people.
Okay, Murdoch said, remember, you don't have to spend your money on it. You, as a consumer, are allowed to not put your money down if you don't want to.
Right.
And this
I
is
won't buy pizzas with pineapples on them.
Oh, man. Well, luckily, there's more pizzas with pineapples on it out there for me.
That's just the perfect example, right?
Yeah.
Like if Ron's and I go for pizza, he might get one with a pineapple on it, and I'm going to buy my own pizza. Like, this is number one in keeping this civil, right? Like in keeping these conversations real, is you have the right as the consumer to make the decision what you consume.
100%. 100%. And it was often the case both ways. And I think we've seen examples of that very recently. Yeah, and it's so true with the vote for your dollar kind of concept. I don't mean vote in a political sense in this way, but I mean like support the products that you want to see in the marketplace, no matter what they are. 100%.
The market driven economy runs on this.
Yeah.
So,
Redac 007 says everything has an agenda, good, bad, or indifferent. All forms of entertainment have an agenda. Shakespeare was very agenda driven. And look, when you boil this topic down, that's why I was surprised at some of the comments I was getting on my Instagram from this, because it's like that knee-jerk reaction where people have to like bite on that word agenda. And I get it. I 100% get it, because that's just the way that our media works. I wouldn't even just say social media, just media in general. That word now has an automatic connotation for people. And look, agendas don't necessarily have to be good, bad, or indifferent, because again, that agenda could be, we're trying to make a comic book that sells lots of copies, and we know that a good way to do that is to have Todd McFarlane drawing covers and to tell stories with Spider-Man inside them, where he's fighting new villains that are exciting and kind of similar to Spider-Man, but they're bigger and beefier. And then that's how you get Venom. Well, those are great selling comic books, and that's an agenda. There's nothing wrong with that agenda on its surface level, in my opinion, although some people have a problem with that kind of agenda, and that's fine too. Okay, so we're hearing from Edward here, which is great, because the one that put forth the question, which we appreciate. Thank you very much for that. Says, yes, I can enjoy a comic and even a movie that has agendas I don't agree with. I just roll my eyes and turn the page, but 99% of what I read these days is horror, and that's how I escape the craziness around me. Yeah, escapism, exactly.
And that's an example of voting with your dollar, right? If you're not reading superhero comics because you feel like it's too agenda driven or it's too whatever driven, read something else. I have a friend who's a priest who got really angry when they broke up Superman and Lois Lane when Bendis was running Superman, and walked away. And I go, bro, just read manga. Like, if you want slice of life, leave it to Beaver comic, or leave it to Beaver storytelling. You can find it in manga. It exists and it's more readily available. Like, sometimes you have to do that. You have to find another way to enjoy the art form you love that meets what you're looking for. So again, Ed reading horror comics. Horror certainly has an agenda. The agenda might be to scare the crap out of you and make you not sleep at night, but it has an agenda.
Or even on a higher level, it might be to help you analyze why certain things scare you, right? And kind of explore yourself that way, which self-exploration is a really cool kind of agenda too.
Yeah, like, and there's a number of things that are like that that's super important. Sean came up with Bomb Queen as his read a book that you don't necessarily agree with the agenda on. Murdoch brought up something important: divided states of hysteria. Is everybody familiar with divided states of hysteria?
I'm not.
So Divided States of Hysteria was a comic series that came out from Image, written by Howard Chaykin.
Okay.
And the thing about Divided States of Hysteria is it's Howard Chaykin doing what I think Howard Chaykin does best, which is making people uncomfortable by beating them about the head with something they know. And I don't mean that in a bad way, right? It's just the thing that Howard does in his current iteration of Howard Chaykin that makes him special. But the problem with Divided States of Hysteria is it was this book that was divisive on the cover. There was a cover where it showed a Middle Eastern man lynched from a flagpole with his pants around his ankles and his stuff cut off. That was a cover of this book. It was designed to make you uncomfortable, and the book made you uncomfortable. And for a long time, I wouldn't stock it in my store because it made so many people uncomfortable. And then I sat down and read the trade. And I went, holy crap, I fell for it. I got sucked in by the talking about Divided States of Hysteria and not about the book. And the book was so good. And Howard told such a great story about not judging people and being better than the hate and all this kind of stuff, that the book really wound up being a solid book. And I started stocking it after that. But that was an example of this idea of agenda getting overrunning the storytelling. And it wasn't even the actual agenda of the book. It was the agenda of the people talking about the book.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's. I think it's funny being a YouTube content creator. I think about that topic a lot because I will often put out a thumbnail, and some people, that's fine if you do call it this. Some people will call it clickbait. But what I'm really doing, in my opinion, is subverting the expectations that the viewer might have. Because let's be honest, I have to get you to watch the video to even start a conversation. Otherwise, you just breeze right by it, and then we never get to have the conversation. So to get people to click on it, one way you can do it is to make them interested. Another way you can do it is to make them upset or to, put something in their face that they go, wait a minute, what's going on here? This guy is usually this way, and now he's being this way. Well, if I do that, kind of like the post I made on IG later, where I kind of, load it with images and our thumbnail tonight, images of ISOM and mouse and everything. Well, if I do that, people might actually tune in to have that conversation. But some people are instantly going to bounce off of it. Some people are going to see that and be like, what are you doing? Why are you, why are you putting this out there? I can't believe you do that. And they bounce off of it. But some people are willing to stick around and have that conversation. And that's exactly like what you just described in my mind. I mean, that's that similar type of idea for sure. Let's see.
Right.
Here.
No, and I'm reading your IG.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I had to remember what my Instagram login was. That's how rarely I use Instagram. Ed, we'll come back to your how would you know question. I stopped reading DC after they wouldn't give Green Arrow and Black Canary a single freaking issue of them being married.
I started that comment for one specific reason, which is, first of all, it's 100% a legitimate point. But also, I think that's actually a topic for a future episode of Devil's Advocate.
This Ed's comment?
No, the Black Canary and Green Arrow comment.
Oh,
and then
yeah, absolutely.
Talk about Colossus and Kitty later.
Yeah.
Relationships in comic books.
Right. When you go back to pop sequentialism, thanks for being here, man. When you go back and read American Flag, it still holds up with a great balance between nuance and trope. Chaykin is right. And I'm the first to admit that sometimes Chaykin's nuance gets lost on me by Chaykin's approach. And I need to be better at not having that happen. And knowing Howard as I know Howard these days, I've gotten better at it, but bro, it's still tough.
Shout out to Matt for being here, by the way. He's a good dude.
Yeah, I love his channel too. There you go. Social introspection is worthwhile.
Yeah.
So here's the I think we need to go back to our original kind of notes that we had, Bronze.
Yep.
One of the things that we can't, and because this speaks to this comment from Ed. When I was thinking agenda, I was leaning more towards politics and trying to force opinions on you. And we'll get to the rest of that later. But the problem, Ed, is that comics have never been without politics. But the question is, when you felt like they didn't have them, was it that you didn't notice them? Or was it that you didn't disagree with them? And I think that's I'm not calling you out necessarily. I'm saying that as a person, right? When I was reading Preacher as a young person, I didn't notice all of the anti-religious stuff that's in it, all of the very political stuff in that book, because I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't worldly enough. I hadn't experienced enough to notice.
Yeah.
Right. And now I read it and it's a very different book. Same with Watchmen. When I was a little kid, Watchmen was about a blue space alien guy. You know, it wasn't about what Watchmen is actually about because I just didn't know any better. And now that I'm old enough to know, there are comics that I certainly am like, I wish this was less political. But it's only that political because I'm smart enough to notice or because I disagree with it.
Well, there's also something that happens too where, and this is a little bit what you might mean by smart enough, but when you're reading as a younger reader, a lot of us get exposed to comic books at a pretty young age, right? And there are metaphor and allegory that are contained within those stories sometimes that just goes over your head because it's not. Think about X-Men. X-Men is a great example. When you're talking about, Magneto and fighting the X-Men, it's really easy to get caught up in he's the bad guy. They're fighting each other. They have these cool powers. All this is going on. But, after a few times hearing in a world that fears and hates us, we're trying, those phrases start to kind of sink in and you start to dive into that a little bit when you get a bit older and start to say, what does that really mean? What is the point of that?
Right. And that's what I mean. Smart enough to recognize the storytelling methods that they're using, right?
Yeah.
Smart enough to recognize what they're trying to tell me. I didn't understand when I first started reading the X-Men. I didn't understand the civil rights parts of that because I'm from an era where that wasn't a huge deal anymore. It was still a big deal, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like it has been the last few years or like it was in the 60s and 70s. Right? Like I come from that middle era where it just wasn't something that was necessarily on the forefront all the time. So I didn't see it. But now being older, I see those connections. I see those things. So I've become smart enough, and I'm literally talking about myself. I'm not saying about anybody else. I'm smart enough to know what I'm trying to be told now when I didn't used to be.
Yeah.
And at the same time, now I have my own opinions on things and I didn't used to. It's that thing. Well, I support such and such political party because that's who my parents support. You haven't formed your own opinions yet. Once you form your own opinions, does that change? So it's this interesting idea of kind of understanding that part of it. But I think, Ed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the crux of your question is, are there less readers today of comics because people have been turned off by the more overtly politicized message in comics?
Yeah. And that to me is where you get to the almost the more salient point, right? Like the more juicy point, at least for sure. And it's one of those things that becomes, to me, almost a question of maybe, are those conversations that are happening in these comic books that people are turned off by, are they maybe too surface level? Are they too in your face? Do they need to be written better or hidden in more allegory or more metaphor? Does the story work on its own without having this kind of, hot button topic in your face at first? Because I think sometimes it's just the appearance of some things that will turn people off to certain comic books. And I'm not personally saying that's right or wrong, by the way. I have my own complicated issues. It's pineapple on pizza.
Well, you mentioned in our, when we were planning this about John Kent and some of the things that have happened around that character. And I think that's a great example of kind of what we're talking about in that regard, right? Like, there's stuff that doesn't even really affect the story that turns people off because it's being dropped in. Or, some of these other, there's some other examples. You mentioned Elektra becoming Daredevil and people having a problem with that. Or, the whole cover Mockingbird asked me about my feminist agenda. Make mine a milkshake. All of these things that have been politicized in comics, almost overwhelming what the actual comics are.
Yeah.
And one of the comments that Pop Sequentialism had said, and it's something that we all, I think, agree with, is that I never steer away from politics, but I wish the first agenda was making a good product. And I think sometimes that in the business of making comics, whether the product is good or not falls to the wayside.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where where we have publishers publishing 50 or 60 covers of a book. You're more interested in what's on the cover than what's on the inside. Or the covers get more attention than what's on the inside.
Yeah.
And you have now the politics having more attention than what's on the inside. We mentioned, and I want to come back to some of these comments here so we can get back to that original question, because Ed said that's what he was going for. You and I talked about ISOM. The Eric, what's his name?
Eric July.
Yeah. I almost called him Eric Judy, but I'm like, no, that's Craig Robinson from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's Doug Judy. Anyway, but that is a book that the politics of that book outshined what was in that book, outpaced what was in that book, got more ink than what was in the book. I've not read the book. I don't know if it's any good or not, but everyone who I heard talking about the book was talking about the politics surrounding the book.
Well, and there's a true nugget of irony there too, which is the politics around the book are, we don't have any politics in this book.
Right. But whereas I would have much preferred, and I think it would have been better for the community as a whole, if the content of the book was the thing we were talking about and the politics were secondary. Whether you agree with Eric July or not, and I don't know enough about the guy to know one way or the other, or to have an opinion about the guy. I think the idea of trying to make a comic that doesn't have any politics in it, in and of itself, is a problem anyway. But like beyond that, I don't know enough about the guy to care. But the fact that I've not heard one review of the book that talks about the content of the book.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so I know my local comic shop has some copies, but I never pick it up because I can never get a review that isn't, well, this book isn't blah, 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 or this book is blah, 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 blah. No. Tell me what's in the damn book. Okay. So we're going to get back to the question at hand. Murdoch, there you go. That's, and that's the best anybody can hope for doing a creator-owned book, right? You may not be the best storyteller, but as long as you got a chance, you got a chance.
Yeah.
So we'll come back to that, Ed, in just a second. Are there less readers today because of the agendas in comics, or is the agenda in comics, and I want your opinion on this, Bronze, I want people to tell me in the chat, is the agenda in comics just another hurdle for new readers?
Well, I think it's yes and yes. I think that there are people that try to boil down the entire lowering of sales or comic book readers as, well, there's these messages in comic books and a lot of us don't agree with it, so we're not buying them. Which, by the way, again, vote with your dollars. That's fine if that's what you want to do. I don't have any particular problem with that. But I don't think it's just as simple as to say that that is the issue with comic book sales. We have a very complex system that has caused comic books to be where they are today. And you can trace, I mean, you can really go back very, very, very far, but you can trace a lot of the issues that we're having in the comic book market today back to the 90s. And, you know, something I've talked about a lot, you have a lot of readers that are more or less aging out of comic books, and you're not attracting a lot of new readers. So it's an interesting, you know, sort of dynamic there, because you want to talk about attracting new readers. That's something that I really believe strongly in. And your natural inclination might be that some of the things that are turning people off to new comic books might be some of the things that would attract new readers. But I think that, you know, like has been said in the comments a few times here, if you're missing that compelling it factor first, it doesn't really matter what you're injecting into your comic book. It doesn't really matter. You could be saying the sky is blue, pineapple on pizza is terrible. It doesn't matter what you're saying if no one wants to read it in the first place.
Right.
You know, and that's where it comes down to me. And unfortunately, we're not showing young readers or new readers what comic books can be, what comic books were for, I'm guessing, pretty much all of us watching this video right now or here on the panel, and have been for our lives, and what they've done for us. Those people are getting, those younger readers are getting those experiences through other ways. And a lot of comic book readers are, you know, that are pre-existing comic book fans are attritioning off for various reasons. Variant covers, the speculation game, flippers,
everything being a new miniseries.
Yeah, exactly. You know, hey, where's my, I was reading Avengers when it was in issue 300, you know, where's issue, you know, 800 that should be out now or whatever, right? Like that there's stuff like that that doesn't make sense to people. And those are all, in my opinion, legitimate arguments to have for why people might not want to read comic books. But one of those elements for sure is that people don't want certain messages in their comic books, and they're willing to vote with their dollars and not buy them. So, you know, and to kind of offer a little bit of a solution in with the diagnosis there, again, I come back to that, you know, just like Pop Sequentialism said, just like we've had other comments, tell that compelling story first, and then you'd be surprised what you can get away with inside the comic book, as long as it has that interesting, you know, candy coating or wrapper that you want to dive into.
Right. So there's something else that I think we need to mention. And it wasn't something I thought about before until something that Ed said a little while ago. And I think it's interesting here other places. Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Frog Crawler. I mean, comics can't be 50 cents anymore because you can't buy anything for 50 cents. But I think this week the number of $9.99 books is certainly emblematic of a bigger problem. But Ed said this has really only happened in the last 20 years, and it's because there's so much, and he goes into, you know, why he thinks that. But I would argue that you're forgetting a major factor here, Ed. What has happened in the last 20 years that never had happened before? Social media. Now there's an echo chamber that exists. Now there's a place you can go and you can find people who share your opinion about that book, and you hear them talk about that book in the way that you want to hear them talk about that book. Just the same way that there's social media where you can hear the other side. A great example is the current Spider-Man run. There are a lot of people who are really angry at Zeb Wells. Sure, whatever. But there are just as many people out there, if you look for them, who aren't, who are really enjoying this run. And I think that's an important thing to remember is you didn't know everything that political figures or famous people or whoever was doing 24 hours a day until the advent of CNN and 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah.
And TMZ and blogs and websites devoted to this kind of stuff. Now that's what's happened in comics. So, we have a phone call,
Let's do it.
and it's our friend Pop Sequentialism. What's up, Matt? How's it going?
Hey, I'm well. How are you?
Can everybody hear him?
A little quiet.
All right, hold on. Let's try better now.
Excellent.
All right, cool. I had him routed through the wrong speaker. What's up, man?
The story of my life.
First, thank you for calling in. Big fan of your channel and everything you do. So, what's up, man? What did you want to bring to the table?
Hey, so and hey, had to say hi to Chris, of course. I think the biggest problems as I see them facing comics today is that number one, comics aren't what they were by format or by content or by price. We have to count manga as comic books in the current age of how we're consuming sequential storytelling. And manga's selling like hotcakes. There's no problem with people picking up manga. But what I think we have to look at is, what you said about things in the 90s not being around today. Certainly the explosion of video games and entertainment of that sort replacing the comic book as kind of the easy go-to thing for kids that weren't out on a baseball diamond or a football field. We have to look at the price change. So when I was collecting comics and working in a comic book store in the late 80s, and I think even into the early 90s, the price of a comic book stayed at about 75 cents for a very, very long time. If you run that by the page count, which was about 36 pages per book back then, and now they're 18 to 22 pages a book, and they cost about $5. When you buy a manga book for $14.95, and you're getting something that can be 120 pages, you're certainly getting more bang for your buck. So having known a lot of comic writers and reading what I do read, I'm impressed that anybody can tell a story in 18 to 22 pages that will get you to come back the next month. Like, how can you get enough content into that limited number of pages to get somebody back? And so I think when you look at, was it Eric July, what did he do? He did a graphic novel. It's like, and everybody's kickstarting graphic novels because they can tell the story they want to tell. They can make it any page count they want. They don't have to conform to a page break where you're going to put advertising or anything else. And frequently these are either teams of people that have been working together for a long time to do a passion project or a one-person project. And I think the one-person projects, for the most part, this isn't everybody, but I think that they suffer for not having a writer working with an artist. And, when you look at what the best stories were in the history of comics, and you can go pretty far back and you can talk about some of the really innovative writing that was happening in the Bronze Age. But when they got extremely good, when people like Frank Miller and Alan Moore entered the game, then you start to see that they're not as good when you go back and read a Frank Miller comic, generally speaking. They haven't aged as well. Certainly not the ones that he was drawing. If you go back and read Born Again, I think that's aged very well. But when you look at Alan Moore, that stuff has aged incredibly well, because when you look at his notes for the comics, there's like 10 pages of notes for every page of art that was produced. Like he really gave the artist he was working with a tremendous amount of information for them to work with. And I think that maybe in some instances, and certainly when you look at Saga the Swamp Thing, the input of Steve Bissett and John Toddleben was immense, and I think it's been underplayed for decades. But as is, I think, the amount of material that Gibbons brought to Watchmen. But when you look at having that huge amount of information to play with, and then having a way of breaking that down through what was then again 36 pages, then you get to tell some pretty compelling stories month after month. And if you know what your arc is going to be and you work on it to have it done before the last issue hits, then you don't hit the types of delays that plague things like All-Star Superman, which is a fantastic, collaboration between a writer and an artist. Yeah. But when you look at the other stuff, as you say, I don't think that politics is really affecting the numbers overall. I think it's pissing off people that were expecting a certain product that they feel like they're no longer getting. And that may be short-sighted, because I think if something works, the law of the land is don't fix it. And there's been a lot of fixing. And then I think those fixes haven't worked. And so you have a really dissatisfied comic base. You've also got, movies. Why, if you can buy a movie ticket, for $4 and get a bunch of entertainment, rather than have to read 36 issues of Spider-Man to get that story into a movie, then the bang for your buck is going to be that movie ticket. And even the cost of DVDs, by the time you get to Best Buy, I mean, that stuff is like $10. And the factor of entertainment for younger viewers, and the free babysitting of the television set for parents, where they're more than happy to buy a film and let the kids watch it 100 times, is going to be, it's just going to happen more often than it does with a comic. I mean, my favorite comic books, you say The Watchmen, when it was coming out, I would go back and read every issue up to the point of the new issue to catch up, to see if I could predict what was going to happen. So maybe I read issue 1 12 times. That's not going to happen that much with anything that's coming out these days. If I read it more than once, that's a surprise. If it does come out in an omnibus and I want to get it in one throw, that's usually how I do it. Like even with something like Immortal Hulk, which I thought was great, I didn't, hang in there month after month. I read it for a little bit and I'm like, well, this is going to get an omnibus. I'll just buy the omnibus. Yeah. So maybe that's a challenge too.
No, it's true. I mean, I think this is relevant. $4 for a movie ticket. But no, I think you're right. I think that's a big part of it, right? Is that these stories aren't necessarily going where people want them to go.
Yeah.
Or expect them to go. But
I will say $4 for a ticket too is, the cheap seats on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the movie opened.
Right.
It's certainly not going to be opening night, and it doesn't account for popcorn and all that. But yeah, those, I guess $18 is probably the average for a movie ticket.
I could buy one of those 50 issue Walking Dead trades for less than it cost me to go see stupid Blue Beetle. But
yep, not a bad movie.
No, I honestly haven't seen it. I bought the ticket and was like, oh, that's maybe more than I wanted to spend on Blue Beetle. Anyway, but I wanted to ask you, because you were right. But do you think you're right on a lot of this, and I completely agree with you, but do you think that there's a level of, if we change editorial to eliminate some of this, like we were talking about, this political kind of stuff, this messaging that maybe some people disagree with, do you think that will create an influx, or do you think things will just continue on the same trend?
Well, I think they're going to continue to make the same mistake, which is they're going after a demographic that isn't reading the comic, and they're not doing anything to get that demographic to read the comic. So if I'm going to target an LGBTQI audience, I should be taking out advertisements on the sites that would track that demographic. I should be taking out ads in publications like The Advocate. Like, everybody in the gay community should know 3 months before I debut a gay character that this new gay character is coming, so that you can get some support. You never see any of that at DC or Marvel. You don't find out until, the Wednesday New Comic Book Day, when, it's a slow week for news, and, PR Newswire, someone pulls off the story that, there's a new Supergirl and she's, a new ethnicity and a new sexual preference. I think with something like Superman, this is really funny. And I mean, certainly if Garth Ennis were writing Superman, he'd be so pansexual, he'd be having sex with everything because he's an alien. And so the same kind of things that would, bind any kind of ethics or morality issue would not bind an alien. But that comic and the way that the character John Kent was written, I think was really written for younger fans. And I think it was a weird pivot. I don't think it was anything anybody wanted. It wasn't anything they were asking for. And it sort of represents the shock value of a change, right? Like, if you're a lazy writer, how do you get people to pay attention to your work? You write something a little bit shocking. I mean, Chaykin learned that years ago, and he's been doing that for a really, really long time. But, and he is a lazy writer, and he'll be the first person to admit it, but he came out of an era where he was actually telling some really groundbreaking stuff, and I think he's fallen into a treadmill of sorts over the last 20 or 30 years. But when you look at, what you're saying, will new editorial help? new editorial will only help if you can get quality writers. Why would a quality writer work for Marvel or DC?
Bingo.
You know, they're not going to make the money on selling 180,000 issues that they can make on 6,000 issues of a self-published comic. I mean, you're a sap if you work for one of the two big companies, unless it's just to build up your resume. And once you do that, you should be out the door as soon as possible. And I mean, you only see people like, well, you know, James Tynion's got a lot of titles out there, and I think that he's making so much money on his solo titles that I just wonder how much longer he'll ever continue working for one of the big two. You know, and you have people like Snyder who just seem to happen to love certain characters and will continue doing it, but his passion project for years was his own creation, you know, the American Vampire, which is, you know, probably coming to a small screen near you. But when it comes to new talent, they don't stay because they're not getting paid.
Right. Ram V is a great example of that, right? Just signed an exclusive deal with DC because it means he gets to tell the Batman story he's always wanted to tell. And when he's done doing that and that contract is up, he'll stop. He's not going to stay there for 30 years. He's not going to be Stan Lee, right? He's not going to eventually be Jim Lee, where he stayed so long, now he's in charge, you know?
Which, you know, a couple of powerhouse writers, certainly Brian Michael Bendis, came up at the tail end of it being possible to kind of gain control and grab the reins. And there was a time where I was looking at possibly writing for Marvel. And you know, I knew a couple of the people that were over there. And I mentioned a character that nobody had touched in 30 years. I made it known to one of my friends who was working with Brian Michael Bendis. And I got a note back from Brian that, oh, I have that character in the canon to use. That character did not appear for at least the next 16 months in any comic he was writing. So I know what the lead time is for the stories he was writing. That character was not part of his plan. But there was a bit of protection of maybe I want to use that. I'm the king of continuity. And I think when you have one writer with so much power that becomes the king of continuity at one of these publication houses, that's going to scare away other writers, whether they've been around for a couple of years or not. You know, that when did they get their shot? You know, like you can only sit on the bench for so long before you feel like, well, I'm going to go, you know, be an all-star on a different team.
Well, and not only that, what is the biggest driver for monetary success for new writers that want to create an awesome new character? It's the hopes that character is going to go on and become the next big screen star, the next Venom, the next character like that. And guess what? You're never going to get from Marvel or DC if you create that character for them. Any of the kickbacks down the road to make that a worthwhile endeavor.
Just talk to Fabrice Sapolsky about that, right? How big of a part?
David Aja.
David Aja is another great example. How big a part was Spider-Man Noir in that first Spider-Verse movie, and he got nothing. He got invited to the premiere, and his name scrolled across the screen, and that's it.
Yeah.
Hey, I didn't ask Gerard about, you know, Penny Parker, but I'm sure it's a similar story. Maybe he got treated a little bit better because he entered it as kind of a superstar, but, you know, and I'm surprised. Why didn't they follow that up with a Marvel manga? That is like the most intuitive thing ever, is to make an actual manga out of a character that is clearly a manga character in the Marvel universe that kids loved in that movie, and we've seen nothing of that character. Like, I mean, they're not making good decisions even when they're handed to them. So, you know, the idea that there's going to be anything smart happening at publication, and I don't know, you know, maybe they're getting word from on up high that we don't want to do that because we're making a more valuable property for a company that has rights that we don't have. Why make a more popular? They did it to Sony over the Fantastic Four. They stopped publishing it for 3 years to make it a title that would be worthless for them, so that they could get it back because they wanted it back. So if Disney is telling, you know, editorial at Marvel, don't build up any of these Spider-Verse characters, and because we want to get the rights back, then maybe that's what's happening. And I mean, certainly if you look at Spider-Man books over the last couple of years, there could be evidence that there's a little bit of self-sabotage happening there. But that, again, seems dumb. Like, you don't cut off your hand because you've got a blister on your thumb.
It's true.
Yeah.
Matt, I thank you for calling in. Everybody head over
Absolutely.
and check out his channel over at Pop Sequentialism on YouTube. Give it a follow, give it a subscribe, click the bell. All the things you would do for myself or Bronze, do for Matt on his channel. Appreciate you calling in, man. We're going to get back to some of these comments and try and wrap this whole thing up in a nice little bow. But I really do appreciate you calling in.
Oh, you got it. I love the show, guys. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks, man.
All right. Always nice talking to you, Matt.
All right. So there was a comment way back when from Ed that I wanted to address.
Okay.
Let me use this example. I see pure joy in your eyes, Kyle, when you talk about the DuckTales book. Why? Because it's pure fun. Leave your worries behind and enjoy the story writing. That's what comics do that I love. I would argue that if you don't see the agenda in the DuckTales book, it's because you're not looking for it. There certainly is one. But it's written well, which is something we've talked about, right? The agenda is cleverly disguised as good writing. Right? Like, at the end of the day, if it was terrible writing, like some of the other books that are coming out from that line, I wouldn't enjoy it as much. But because it's good writing, and I'll be honest, because of Launchpad McQuack, not because of much else, I really enjoy that book because, again, it's good storytelling. So I think that's the big thing. Sean, I think in today's world, some of it is I want it now culture. For someone, issue to issue is hard to do, or digital might be better because you can buy it home. Plus, I think TV and cinema play a part. Yeah, that's fair. But I think it's that. I think even more than the I want it now culture is it's the de-evolution of the narrative. And I don't just mean that in terms of the written word. I mean the narrative we live under. So much of what we follow on social media, what we watch on TV, what we hear on the radio, what we listen to on podcasts is just mimicking what we already think. We go out and we find people to tell us what we already think. And when somebody tells us something different, we don't necessarily respond well.
No, perfect example about that. I really want to expand on that for 1 second. If you don't believe that's true, I have been asked so many times, why do people want reviews of products if they're just going to complain about the review? Here's why people want reviews of products. And by products, it could be an entertainment thing, but it could also be a physical consumer good. They want to have their opinion validated. They want to find somebody who's going to say, you were smart for buying that thing because it's awesome. And if they don't do that, they don't pay attention to that reviewer. That reviewer is an idiot. And there's a critical reason why reviews should exist. And you may not always agree with those reviews. Hope the best reviews will include the reasons why. And you can make your own determination. But that is 100% baked into that kind of narrative around, what it is for people. They're looking for that echo chamber.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. And, I'm one of these people who my entire life has been a holder of minority and contrary opinions. Dan makes fun of me all the time on his show because I don't like superhero. I don't like a lot of the superhero movies that come out because I have a set expectation for them. And I'm never going to not tell people my opinion of those books because of that, right? So it's this idea of when you're talking about the agenda in comic books, you see that agenda then translated onto screen. And one of the things that the X-Men movies did really poorly, the original 3 at least, I haven't seen all of the new ones as many times as I've seen those, is to encapsulate that original agenda of the X-Men in those books. Those movies were actually just Wolverine movies disguised as X-Men movies. Right? They weren't about the X-Men. So there's this idea of you want to hear people say what you already think. And when you hear someone say something different than what you already think, you don't respond well. And then at the same time, if you feel like someone has co-signed what you think, you can say it so much louder.
Well, and listen to what Kyle just said about the X-Men movies there, and think about that for a second, because the X-Men movies, especially the later ones, are often maligned. And what do people really love? What do people always talk about positively? The first X-Men movie. And what are some of the core principles happening in the first X-Men movie? Yeah, Wolverine's a really cool character. You kind of follow him going to the school, a little bit like a Kitty Pryde type character from the comic books to kind of get that lens of what it's like to go to the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters. But what you really get is a story about turning humans into mutants, to really expose that the nexus of what X-Men is, and the fear of the unknown and the alien and bigotry and all those things, through the lens of Senator Robert Kelly and being turned in to a mutant and what Magneto's trying to do. That is a perfect example.
Yeah. So that's, I think, a part of this, right? Like this idea of you're hearing what you already are expecting to hear or hearing what you want to hear, that we shouldn't be expected to hear something different than we want. And the premise of a good society, it goes all the way back to Plato, is that all good ideas, Plato said that all good ideas should flow into the boulevard, which means that if you have a valid idea, you should put it out there for others.
Yeah.
And the best ideas will be the ideas that are glommed onto. It shouldn't be that you shouldn't be expected to hear something you don't agree with. You should, in fact, welcome that idea, because there's no way to grow or become a further person without that.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about entertainment and we talk about escapism, what you don't want is someone beating you about the head with something you don't agree with, or with something you do agree with. I agree with, I tend to be kind of a lefty politically, which, but I don't need to be beat about the head by, the people on TV to believe what I believe. Right? So there's a balance that has to be struck between telling people what they need to hear, telling people what they want to hear, and telling a good story. Like, again, that I think is the premise of all of this, right? If comics were just great across the board, this topic would be, why aren't more people reading comics? Not, should comics have an agenda?
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to add, it's going back a little bit to something Matt said on the phone call, but this to me encapsulates it. JD Smith writes in, personally, I want a complete story. I didn't mind buying all 12 parts of Maximum Carnage back in the 90s for $1.25 each, but these days it has to be affordable. $3 to $5 a pop, I'm out. I'll have to wait for the trade paperback, and since I'm going to have to wait, I'll wait for my library to get it. Now, here's the interesting part of that to me. It's a comment I totally agree with, by the way, but think about it. A 12-part Maximum Carnage series at the prices today would cost you $60 if you were to go read it. Is Maximum Carnage $60 worth of entertainment for somebody in today's dollars? And what else could you buy for $60? You could go buy a video game you love that could give you 60 to 1,000 hours, depending on the content within it. And when it comes back to the value proposition, you're fighting an uphill battle to get people to read your comics at the money that they're at now, the page count, like we talked about earlier, the contents of an individual story. And then also, we like to binge stories these days. Netflix binge watching, it's really a real thing out there now. And if I have to wait month to month to read the story and it's not that good or it's not that engaging, and on top of all of that, if I personally don't agree with what's being told in that storyline, or I feel like it's being done ham-fistedly, or it's beating me over the head, and you wonder where your readers are or where they're coming from, I do completely understand where that is happening today. And that's where I'll agree that, I think that there are some elements here that the comic book industry as a whole needs to evaluate and learn their lessons on, and then approach them in a more deliberate fashion.
All right. So, here we go. Murdoch, the writer's agenda should not be a frying pan upside the head. It can be there, but don't make it the focus of the damn story. But at the same time, some of the greatest comics ever written are exactly that. Right? Like Days of Future Past is all agenda driven. The Watchmen is all agenda driven. Sandman, all agenda driven. Right? Some of these, and I keep naming DC books, but when you go to Marvel, Captain America has always been agenda driven. It's never not been. The X-Men have never not been. These things have, have always been agenda driven. But the key is, again, the stories are good enough. I disagree.
I don't know. That's my point, is that they were
The
story
stories
driven.
are good enough that the agenda is folded in,
Yeah.
not sitting on top.
Right. Oops. Sorry.
So that's
Yeah, they brought in
that's what I
balance.
mean. Yeah, the story was told in such a way that agenda, which was always the fuel, is just the fuel. It's not the fuel and the car and the passenger and the people the car is hitting as it drives down the road. And I think that's the big like disconnect, right? In today's comics. And I think that's an important thing that, you know, Nick brings up, that it's story driven first and that they brought in balance. 100%. There's so
Yeah.
much imbalance. I would grant that premise, as much as I don't want to say, I would not grant the premise that comics today are too political or have too much agenda. I would grant the premise that they are imbalanced. That one thing or the other is always taking precedent, and they're never working together in, you know, sympathetic. They're never sympathetic like that.
Right. Like, I mean, you can go back, take agenda completely out of it in a way. Go back to what Star Wars, the original trilogy. I'm not going to talk about modern Star Wars. Good Lord, I'd have people bringing out pitchforks. Go back to the original Star Wars trilogy. And what is the original Star Wars trilogy based on? It's based on Joseph Campbell. It's based on a hero's tale. It's based on a hero's journey. Those ideas are what drives that story. Now, it's done on such a level that when you watch that original trilogy, most likely that's not most people's first take on what that story is about. They don't connect the dots. But if you look at it on a deeper level, if you start to analyze what the story is, all those layers are there, and it's actually very plain to see. It's masterfully done. You take core concepts that are interesting and fascinating, but you've weaved it into the story in such a way that the story is what's drawing people in. The special effects, the stories, all those things you like to talk about with the car there. Or you could talk about it being a pizza where it's got this wonderful, delicious crust, this great tangy tomato sauce, excellent cheese, and fantastic pineapple. That thing.
I had to take you off the air for the pineapple comments.
I understand.
No, but you're right. You're absolutely right. It all has to work together. And so often nowadays, I think this is kind of the answer to the question of, you know, should comics have an agenda? The answer to the question is they can't not have an agenda, but the agenda has to be handled in such a way that the storytelling shines through. It's Nick made, I wish I had come up with this example my own self. Like, this is, I'm really angry that I didn't think of this. But Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, were exactly that. It's, here's where Green Lantern's wrong. Here's where Green Arrow's wrong. Here's where they both need to be better. And telling that story in such a way that, okay, I might disagree with what Denny and Neil are saying is the right thing in this situation, but the storytelling and the logic they're presenting brings me along with the characters. That is such a great example.
Yeah.
Oh, big angry I didn't think of it.
And also, Jenna, here to take your wonderful comment and put it through the lens of what we're talking about tonight. I'm not hurting you with the pineapple because I ordered it on my half of the pizza, and you can put whatever you want on your half of the pizza. And it should be pineapple, but it's okay if it's not. You'll evolve one day. Sorry, I have to. I'm telling you, pepperoni, jalapeno, get that spicy in there. Makes the sweet so much better.
But no, and so, like I said, I think the last thing I wanted to say, and I wrote this out so I could reread it out of the notes that I sent to Bronze. The last kind of point I wanted to make on this is this. I knew it wasn't Ed's intention when he asked the question. I knew what his question was, and it was about readership. But so often when I hear people bring up this idea that comics are too political, that comics have too much of an agenda, that writers are beating you over the head with their agenda, are usually saying that they want their comics now the way they were back then. And they're forgetting the point that they never were like that.
Yeah.
You can't have something be like it used to be when it never was. There's a line that a certain politician uses to, put on hats of a certain color that is a premise that I wouldn't grant, because in order to make something how it used to be, it had to have at some point been that for everyone. And it wasn't. You want X-Men the way Chris Claremont wrote them? You can have that, but you can't tell me Chris Claremont didn't have an agenda. You want Punisher the way, Punisher was intended by Jerry Conway? You can have that, but you can't tell me Jerry Conway didn't have an agenda.
Well, and to speak to that,
Mhm.
let's say you wave your magic wand and you put Chris Claremont back on the X-Men. Do you think Chris Claremont's the same Chris Claremont that wrote those stories? Is he going to tell the exact same stories that you're looking for now? Are you going to interpret them the same way that they were written back then?
Right. That's exactly it. It's people feel things and believe things, and they can't help but insert it into their work. Writing, drawing, editing, it's all there. And so this idea that we want comics to be like they used to be, where they're pure escapism, they never were. It's just how you perceive them. Part of that is, again, this story first mentality, right? That the story is the casing that everything has to go in. So you have an opinion, you have an agenda, you have a political point you want to make. Great. You can make it in the framework of the story. But I don't think people noticed because of that. And so I think that's the important part to remember, is it never was without this. Again, Superman came from a political place. Captain America came from a political place. All of these books came from some form of agenda. Now, there are some very rare books that are truly and honestly agenda-free. But those are books that are talking about why you hate Mondays, which is an agenda. Or why you prefer lasagna over spaghetti, which is an agenda led by Big Flat Noodle. Like, these are things that you have. Everything is influenced by the people who make it. You just have to find books that have the storytelling that makes that agenda tolerable.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well said.
We had a whole bunch of stuff we were going to talk about that we never got to.
Fuel for future shows. I mean, we never
even talked about Peter and MJ.
Yep.
And I do think we need to go back to that comment about when they wouldn't let what's
Black
his face?
Mary and Green Arrow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be fun to talk about relationships in comic books. That conversation.
Pop sequentialism. I've done a lot of theater in my life. The only play I've ever done, the play I've done the most is The Odd Couple, solely because it means generally I get to eat linguine. So, I love linguine.
Oh, the best part about this whole show we do is that it's all through the lens of food.
I'm very hungry. I haven't eaten since noon. It's been 12 hours. I'm starving.
Same.
But no, like I said, Ed, I thank you for your question. I just think that a big thing we need to do in the fandom of comics is reframe the question in a way that allows it to be answered. So are there less readers because of the political messages in comics today? Probably. I think absolutely the answer is yes. Should comics have an agenda? Should comics be political? I think absolutely the answer is yes. So I think we need to framework it in such a good way. And people do complain too much, Reef the Sea. I am the king of them. So
yeah, most of us are comic book fans.
right. We are the king. We are the best at it. Like if there was a pro team of complaining about stuff, it would be us.
We'd be very, very good at it. We'd be versus the Star Wars fans, and it would be a lot of overlap.
The John Arbuckle of complaining. No. I'm the Odie the dog of complaining.
Yeah, remember John Arbuckle doesn't actually exist.
Right.
It's all right.
By the way, y'all, if you're on TikTok, find Odie the dog on TikTok. It's just a bulldog that's been trained to sit in front of a microphone and snore. It's just a video. It's the most soothing thing. It's a bulldog sleeping and snoring. It's great. Before we get out of here, though, I wanna again, Murdoch, I don't think there's any choice. They have to be part of the story. They just have to be part of the story. They shouldn't be the entire story.
Yeah, I think that comes back to that balance.
Yep. So, I want to mention this website, bit.ly/Devil's Advocates. bit.ly/Devil's Advocates. If you have an idea for a topic you'd like us to tackle, go there, fill out the form, tell us what the topic is. Bonus points if you can make a food analogy that we could start building our thought processes on.
I don't know how to take that, Jay, but I will assume it's a compliment about my voice and not a narrative about my content. By the way,
it's about soothing voices.
People are bringing this up, and I misspoke. Actually, I believe the popular comic is Garfield doesn't exist, and John is going insane and just talking to himself. I might have had that backwards. I'm sorry if I mixed that up.
I've heard theories that none of them exist. Like, where here's the John doesn't exist theory, that John is a figment of Garfield's imagination as he slowly starves to death. Odie doesn't exist, because Garfield is bored. He's just messing with shadows. Garfield doesn't exist and John is going crazy. There's so many great theories about why Garfield is the way Garfield is. And I will tell you the answer. It's because Jim Davis let other people write him.
Yeah, the opposite of Bill Watterson. He just went all commercial all the time.
Yeah. I've been to the Garfield studios, to Jim Davis studios. It's wild.
Oh, cool.
Prefer Garfield as an eldritch god?
It's got more potential.
H.P. Lovecraft's take on Garfield, I'm there for.
Oh,
I
cool.
didn't, but I would have if I'd have known. So we're going to wrap up because, Bronze and I are both very hungry after talking about pineapple on pizza so much.
I got to go write some comics with a bunch of politics in them, too.
Right. I'm going to go write a comic about pasta. The Pasta Lariat. Oh, it's going to star Odin. Anyway, but we will see everybody next week here on Devil's Advocates, where we will be discussing a topic that's almost as controversial as this one. Especially when some people are in the running for some of these things. Do comic book awards matter? That's next week here on Devil's Advocates. We'll see you then.
Join the party. Head over to our link tree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.